Madam Superintendent,
Aloha.
um, I just wanted to ask a few questions. First of all, the only high school in my uh, legislative district, my house district, is Kahuku High School, which, by the way, beat private schools in
Yeah.
football this year,
Oh
so
yeah.
it's all
Go
good.
go Red Raiders.
No offense, Rep. Keho Kalole, but it's okay. We talked about that. I've been working for the last 6 months or so with Mr. Kashiwai and, Mr. Masden there. And I understand as an extension of Mr. Carlson. And my concern is about the facilities, and I'm sure you're aware of the unique situation in
Right.
Kahuku, being in a flood zone.
Right.
And so I just wanted to ask you here, what are some of the plans that you have in mind for Kahuku, which doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the west side of Oahu, isn't quite a neighbor island school, doesn't really have the high population to demand attention, but it's a school that needs fixing, but we don't have a good track record yet of fixing schools that need fixing. We kind of just build new schools where we need to do that. I am grateful for the maintenance work that's been done and a lot of those things. So if I could just get a few thoughts from you, and then I'll
Sure.
proceed to my other
Sure.
questions.
And I will ask Dan to come and comment on that as well. But as you know, former complex area superintendent Leah Albert was an absolute advocate for Kahuku, and continues to be an advocate even in her retirement. And I think Dan was out there last month or the month before. Perhaps you were there as well, looking at the field and the bleacher situation. And I know we've made some of those repairs, but I don't know, Dan, if you can elaborate a little more on that.
Yes, sir. I did visit Kahuku a few weeks ago and had a chance to see eyes on. And again, we agree. Following that visit, I did what I could with our facilities maintenance folks, sent out some teams to the mold issues that they had in some of the portables. Again, some of those things that I can directly control right now. The flooding issue is a much larger, huge issue. I think we all acknowledge that. Again, when the school was originally placed there back in the 1800s, there was no consideration over the elevation of the school facility, and since then they've obviously built around. We have engaged, and previously, obviously, as you well know, have engaged with the Army Corps of Engineers. We took a look at some of the storm drains, and again, we came back. We did confirm that they're just dry wells. So again, we are looking at different ways in which maybe we can utilize those to actually enable the drainage to cross the road, as you well know, needs to happen. Again, it potentially a huge project, but one we were trying to partner with other partners, and as you probably know, obviously those other partners didn't necessarily come to the table with the money that we were anticipating, so hence a delay. But just know that we are looking at it. Leah Alberts is a very vocal advocate, and we are definitely aware and working on it.
Thank you so much. I'm aware of your visits. In fact, these committees have gone out to Kahuku over these last 6 months, and even Mr. Mike McCartney's been out there as well. And so he's aware of that. And as you may know, I did start a community-based organized support effort to do this, and Mr. Masden was heavily involved in that. And so my concern is that I hear some of my colleagues say, we've been talking about this for 5 years, 10 years, our community is more than ready, and we have engaged in a lot of volunteer work to fix our own school. But those, as you know, are only temporary fixes. And so I look forward to continuing this dialogue to look at some of these longer term issues as I've met with the Army Corps, and we've talked about this, but I am grateful for helping our school in this unique situation. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. Did Mr. Kashiwai want to say something, or? Oh, okay. Just checking. Thank you. Mahalo. My second question follows with Rep. DeCoit. Can you explain to me how effective the weighted student formula is as a parameter for schools of student populations of less than 250? What I have in mind here is I have principals that are wearing multiple hats. And they're telling me that they're concerned that the weighted student formula gives them too much weight for a small elementary school. Now, I'm not saying we need to close down schools. I know that's something nobody wants to talk about. But I just want to ask and put that out there and ask you in addition to what I heard about your superintendent reserve, I just would like to know what are some other options principals have? Are there models that we can explore that might give more relief to some of these smaller schools on the neighbor islands and even here on Oahu, like in my district?
So I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
Thank you.
So thank you for that question. We have done a lot of work in this area. The Committee on Weights, it was COW 9 this time, so they've met 9 times to try to tweak this formula and get it closer to perfection, I think, every time. One of the things, we did a study on weighted student formula, a third-party study a couple of years ago, and one of the things that was, several things came out, that it was transparent and predictable, but not adequate. So I think the adequacy happens in a lot of areas, and what we've done to try to address part of the adequacy piece is develop base funding. So what that does is that ensures, and base funding, and again on that slide 20, it says what the base funding is for each type of school. So an elementary school receives $259,000 of base funding. So that assumes that every elementary school needs a principal, a SASA. I mean, we don't dictate what those needs are, but there is that level of base funding. So that is to help ensure that those smaller schools have that amount. And when you look at the total amount per pupil after you add up the per pupil and the base funding, those smaller schools are getting a larger increment in the total per pupil than other schools are receiving of the larger schools. But again, that base funding was trying to address part of the adequacy piece, but then the other thing that we've tried to do, and that you have all supported as well, as I mentioned before, is additional funding in the weights. One thing that was approved, I think it was 2 years ago now, an additional $55,000 per school was added into that base funding. So that's the value of an additional teacher. Again, the principals didn't have to hire a teacher. They could use that for other uses, but it was the value of a teacher was added into the base funding. So again, we continue to try to address the adequacy portion, but I think having the transparency and the predictability does help folks through this process, as you know. And we do look, that part of that study looked at how other districts do it, you know, and that Committee on Weights really wrestles with, again, how to perfect this a little bit more, and they're taking smaller steps each time to make it better.
Thank you for sharing that. I just have 2 thoughts. One, I've heard some principals perhaps say that giving up that flexibility in determining where funds go, but having a predictable amount of people in their administration that can help them might have them take off those extra hats they have to wear. What are your thoughts on that? And then also second, in terms of the weighted student formula, and I'm not quite clear on this, but I understand there isn't necessarily an ability, or perhaps there is, in carrying over funds that perhaps an administrator might not need in 1 year, but may need in another year. For example, in purchasing Chromebooks 1 year, and then perhaps with maintenance needs or replacement values. What are your thoughts on those 2 questions I have?
Okay, so 2 pieces. First one is what I would consider more of a staffing formula. We had that several years ago and have moved away from that. So we've moved more to the weighted student formula instead of preserving staffing. So again, that allows the principal to determine the staffing level needs that they can afford within the pot that they are provided.
So sorry, if you don't mind me asking, so was that move more beneficial?
For some, I think it was. I mean, I think for the system-wide, I think that moving to the weighted student formula and giving principal choice allowed for some more flexibility for them rather than requiring a certain level of staffing. So again, then that principal can use that autonomy and their unique school situation to determine the needs for their programs that they need to implement at that school.
And then regarding
the carryover. So carryover, every school, we use a by statute, the DOE is allowed to carry over 5% of our budget. So we give that as a guideline to our schools that they can carry over 5% of the budget. However, if there's a school that has a large expenditure that they're expecting, we will work with them and allow them to carry more than 5% over. We do watch and monitor that. We do encourage that this year's funding be expended on this year's students. But again, we know that, and we have done it in cases where they wanted to buy laptops and go one-to-one, so they've tried to accumulate those funds to make that happen within. We have allowed that to happen. If every school did it and needed to do 5%, that's going to push us over our statutory, what we're allowed to do. So we do have to monitor that, but that is some flexibility that we have and we do provide to our principals. But again, 5% is the general rule that's allowed.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
Just one more question, chairs, if that's okay. Today, a mentor of mine, Auntie Tammy Smith at, she basically, and this is, I'm talking about building off of what Rep. Jordan's talking about with Hawaiian language, but also with Hawaiian foods. And Superintendent, if I can talk to you about that. Our school lunches, they don't necessarily reflect the food that is indigenous to this land. And Puahala Elementary, some of their parents advocated for a fresh fruit and vegetable program that they're rolling out today. And my question is, what plans do you have in mind, or are you aware of, to make this more widespread throughout our state? Of course, with a lot of our local farmers, such as Rep. DeCoit, you know, we're looking at integrating some of these things, and I know it does touch on some federal mandates that we have as well, and some other issues that we can look at. But I'm wondering, is the department flexible enough to look at implementing something like this, instead of having every parent organization at every school come and petition for this?
Right. I hate to say that it's also in Dan's area, but I do think this has been an issue for a number of years. And I think everyone is wanting to support local farmers within the requirements of the federal laws. And so what we're looking at now is how we can push some of the limits on those. I know that Amy, for example, has been working with some of the principals around what they can do maybe to take over more of the management of their school lunch programs, so that they can buy local. But I think one of the limitations is first our procurement code, then the federal requirements around certifying foods, which is not an easy thing. And then finally, if it's broken down into smaller areas, then some of the farmers will be able to sell their product. But if we're going statewide, and making sure I'm accurate on this, if we're going statewide, a lot of times the volume is not there or the timing is not there. If we need carrots this week, we need carrots this week. We can't, wait a couple of weeks later on.
I do
and so there's
understand.
some timing issues.
There's some
with
year
state.
ahead planning that
Yeah,
goes
there's
into
some
this.
of that, but again, if we're looking at how we could break that down into smaller units and potentially then gain some flexibility. Is there anything like that? Yeah. It does drive the cost up. And that's one of the things that we
Is
have
that
to look at
hypothetical
as
though,
well.
or is that actual? Is that hypothetical?
My understanding is it's actual, because some of those large, sort of, I don't want to say mass produced, but you know what I mean, high volume products like carrots or something like that, they're pretty cheap. And I think the smaller farmers are looking more at the high end kinds of produce that you can have a bigger return. And our kids are not necessarily into the high end. To be quite honest, a lot of kids are just not into fresh fruit and vegetable. It would be great if they were, and it would be great if their families were, because I think that's part of where the eating habits come from. But
Well, change can happen.
change can happen. It certainly can.
Did you want to mention anything? Oh, okay. Thank you, chairs.